Hidden dimension of this that has been mentioned in passing, but none of you have focused in on, well, David did to some extent, is the innovative capacity of the Nordic states contrasted with our high levels of dependence on foreign companies to do our development for us. And I suppose one part of the question is, where does that come from, do you think? Does that strike any of you as being significant, a significant difference between ourselves and the Nordics? And in particular in the Finnish case, as you suggested in your paper on Finland, you saw it as an opportunity to develop, if you like, a new productive route out of the crisis. And that seemed to have been very much based on the success of developing this strong indigenous company, Nokia. And I was a bit disappointed you didn't focus in on where that came from, and in other words, how public policy helped to facilitate the emergence of that. So that's the question.
I just have two brief questions. One for Professor Andersen. He said there's 20% of Danish people don't participate in education. And I was wondering if there is any analysis of why that is, being given the fact that it's free and it's highly desirable. And second, to David Begg, does he know, is there any analysis of why the rate of participation in trade unions has declined so dramatically? Thanks.
I'm Paula Clancy. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of TASC. It's really directed at Torben Andersen, my question. You mentioned that one of the challenges that are facing the Nordic countries now is increasing wage inequality. And I suppose in the context, I was just reading a new report by the New Economics Foundation in the UK, which was suggesting that while for inequality or for reducing inequality, redistribution to the tax system is important, perhaps more important is disparity in market incomes. And so I'm just wondering how the Nordic countries are, well, how you're doing on that issue, but then how you're approaching it, because you imply that there is an increasing problem. I mean, perhaps part of the solution is this emphasis on keeping the wage floor up through employment and high incomes there, fed by education. But I'm just wondering, at the other end of the spectrum, is there any discussion about keeping very excessive incomes down? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Let me start with the last question on inequality. Because it's what we have seen is an increase in inequality in market income. And as you suggested, it's both the bottom and the top which is driving this. At the bottom, it's of course the problem of those lagging qualifications to find job. And of course, you don't see much downward wage pressure in the Nordic countries because we have the minimum wage, but then it pops up in terms of unemployment. And there's very, very clear and well documented that those with low skills, they carry most of the unemployment, in particular the long-term unemployment. In the top end, we have seen some increase, not like in the US and in the UK, but we have seen some increase. There has not been that much discussion about sort of curtailing wages in the upper end. There's some discussion, but not that much. But there is a very important discussion when you go from market income to disposable income, because now, as I said earlier, that basically it's in the market income you create the foundation for the equality. But we have seen a very important contribution to increasing inequality coming from the design of the tax system, namely taxation of real estate housing. And there has been some, and now I speak in particular for Denmark, but also some of this has happened in Sweden, reduction of taxes on housing. And then in a period where house prices have been increasing, that has really benefited the high-income groups. So substantial part, if you look at Gini coefficients and so on for Denmark, you see an increase in recent years, and a substantial part of that is really driven by the combination of what has happened in the housing market and the taxation scheme. So there's a lot of discussion about taxing housing, which is there's a lot of economic arguments why it should be done, efficiency and distribution. Politically, it's extremely difficult to make a popular understanding why such taxes make good sense. It's also related to globalization. It's actually an immobile tax base, so there's a lot of arguments for that. Concerning education, There are many reasons. What we see is an extreme high level of dropouts. So a lot of these youngsters, they start on some education and they drop out. We have also seen a twist. Earlier we had a problem with females not getting the education to the same extent as males. Now it's swapped around. The females are performing rather well, but we have a huge group of males who end up not getting education, starting dropping out and so on. And then there's of course a lot of discussion, what is the reason for this? What is going wrong through basic schooling? Do they not get sufficient qualifications? Are they not motivated? Has this education system shifted to be too focused on particular ways of learning and so on, which makes it difficult in particular for the boys to cope with this. Many issues have been discussed. So there's not one single answer to your question, but it's a very relevant question. And as I indicate, there's a lot of discussion of what to do about it, because the problem is not the financing and the education system is there, the capacity is there, and still we don't perform that well.
Could you foreign direct investment?
Sure, because it's a very interesting and intriguing question at the same time. But let me first comment on the dropouts from the secondary education, which is a problem in our case too. Finland has had excellent results in PISA results on basic education, but really the dropout rate in secondary education, in our case also, is more than 10% of each age cohort, and it's concentrated among the boys. And it's really a difficult problem we are facing, and we have joint discussion with Nordic colleagues how to deal with that. That's really a problem. Okay, this question on the innovative capacity and the background to it, that's really very interesting, and I would like to combine it to the question, to the notes made by David Begg also, because he mentioned this similarity in migration, which is very important, attitude to immigration, but also the difference that Ireland is the home place of multinationals, so to say, but the Nordic countries, traditionally, they are one of the birthplaces for multinationals. Actually, it's noteworthy that in the Nordic countries, the domestic-based big industry was created in the early 20th century already. And now this big industry has grown multinational. And it's shifting its production, particularly in manufacturing, in masses abroad, and that's a problem. But I think one consequence of this domestic rise of big industry is this old interest in, say, technical education. I think engineer intensity in the tertiary education system in Finland is one of the highest in the world. So that there is a great supply of engineers, and I think also the relative wage level of well-educated engineers is quite low. I think that is one of the background of the rise of the Nokia, so that there was a kind of a source of innovative capacity in very competitive engineering education. And at the same time, there was a joint venture between the Nordic countries in the 1980s to standardize the emerging market for telecommunications, so that we also, Ericsson and Nokia also had a kind of advantage of creating these joint international standards. But then Nokia very rapidly became multinational. Nowadays, it has about 20,000 employees in Finland, which is about less than 20% of the labor force of Nokia. Also, Nokia is up to 90% foreign-owned. And, for instance, in 2009 alone, when our GDP dropped by whole 8%, which shows our sensitivity to foreign trade, 2% of this was thanks to Nokia. 2 percentage points. But actually this fall of the GDP share of Nokia was almost totally reflected at this particular time point in the profits of Nokia, and so that this hit was felt by the foreign owners of Nokia. So that was not much reflected in domestic employment. Now I think Nokia has not much manufacturing left in Finland anymore. But Finland still is the R&D base of Nokia, so that most of these 20,000 employees by Nokia are in R&D. They are very much engineers. And of course now Nokia is running down its R&D investment because it's a company in problems, and so we will face this employment problem. But so far it seems to be the case that most of these R&D people who have been sacked out by Nokia, they do find a place elsewhere, job elsewhere. So that so far adjustment has been surprisingly smooth. So that they are founding their own enterprises. Nokia has created around itself a kind of a park of smaller, very innovative enterprises, and so far it has run quite smooth. But of course, the fear is there that more problematic days may be ahead. Thank you.
Please. Eilish Kelly from the Economic and Social Research Institute. Just a question for Dr. Jukka. One of the issues faced in Ireland at present has been a rapid rise in unemployment, which has gone from 4% to over 14% since the onset of the recession, and a big part of that now is long-term unemployment. You spoke about something similar happened to Finland during its crisis, and as Mr. Begg pointed out in his presentation, it reached 17% in about 1994 and it's now back to 7%. I suppose my question is kind of two parts. First of all, what were the steps that Finland took to get its unemployment rate back down? Professor Andersen spoke about active labour market policies. I'm just wondering how much of a role did they play? And secondly, when people talk about Finland and their unemployment issue during that time period, they often say it took them a long period of time to get it back down again. Looking back, do you think could something have been done differently, or could different policies have been implemented to try and get that unemployment down quicker, so that in some ways Ireland can in some ways learn from what Finland did? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Pertti Majanen, ambassador of Finland here in Dublin for 2 years now. I'm very grateful to the professor from Limerick raising the innovation question and to look into that, and this is a comment only, and it is concerning the innovation cooperation we have launched between Ireland and Finland, and in terms of the Global Innovation Index, nowadays we have all kinds of indexes and rankings and so forth. Sometimes they are true, sometimes partly true, and sometimes nothing at all. But in the Innovation Index, Finland has traditionally been among the 5, 6, and I think the other Nordic countries, I don't have this information now, but about the same. Ireland at the moment on the latest is around 17, 18, so also a very good performance. But our innovation cooperation is based very much on complementarities at the moment. And looking into Ireland and Ireland's position, there is one criterion on that ranking terminology or typology, and that is the business transaction capacities and capabilities, marketing approaches, and the business climate. And this is a component on the list where Ireland ranks number 1. So you have ample possibilities for going on in that sector, and when we are talking about having better growth, having jobs created, innovation is there. But this is also a sector where cooperation and reciprocal learning would be very much possible, and we try to go ahead with this. Thank you.
In identifying characteristics of the Nordic countries, Professor Andersen mentioned the high level of tax and the high level of trust in institutions. In Ireland, historically we've had a level of tolerance with tax avoidance, tax evasion, and general tax non-compliance, and particularly in recent times, with the reputational damage in relation to how the crisis was, failed to be forecast and addressed. I think institutions have suffered. So would he, or indeed the panel, have any comments to make on how the Nordic countries managed to have that high level of trust in institutions, and any advice maybe to offer?
The trust has been built up over years, and trust is something it takes a long time to create. You can easily destroy it. I think in the Nordic context and in relation to the public sector and the tax, the local municipal structure has been important. That most of these schemes grew out of the municipal structure. So you paid a tax in the local area, and you saw that there were school bills and so on. So I think that's part of the explanation. I think one should also add that there's often said that we have very strong norms. People would obey to sort of social norms. They would pay their tax and so on. Maybe that's true, but I think those norms would not exist without controls in the system. So we also have very tight controls. For instance, in terms of income taxation, very, very strict controls. We have a personal number. You cannot really get any money without supplying your personal number. If you supply your personal number, the tax authority would immediately know that you earn this money and so on. So there's a lot of sort of checks and balances built into the system. So it's not just something coming out of the blue. So it's a balance. Of course, we also have discussions about, is this control going too far? There's been campaigns like, could you tell if you think your neighbor is cheating with social transfers and so on? And of course, this is a very delicate balance.
Thank you. On the trust issue, let me only say that really the homogeneity of the society, which David Begg mentioned, I think that's one strong historical factor because behind the trust in our institutions. But as I hinted in my own talk, I think in our case, the trust in the institutions was under heavy pressure during the crisis years, and I think it was during these years that the social partnership and really the labor market well-organized labor market institutions made a very useful service in really maintaining the trust in society. They were not that capable in preventing the boom, overheating during the boom, so that the centralized income policies badly failed during the boom years. But then during the crisis, they made a useful service in also getting the wage system under control. That's and question was addressed to me concerning unemployment. I think one of the weak spots in our reaction to the crisis of the 1990s is really that we let the unemployment surge so rapidly, and active labor market policies where we had a strong tradition were run down, so that the priorities of economic policies were not correct under the crisis years. That has to be frankly put. So that it took 2 decades really to run the unemployment rate down to this 7%. And that was only thanks to very, very strong growth during all these years, so that the labor demand was growing. And as a permanent result of the crisis, there was long-term unemployment remained high until this millennium, and also there was permanent exclusion from the labor force among those, so that labor market exclusion also came to a large scale. So that's really one lesson, that you should avoid such a kind of mass surge in unemployment. And I think that's really a serious issue we are facing now, if this crisis in Europe is going to deteriorate, as it seems to be the case, looking at the news of today again.
Thanks. So, well, on the question of trust, Kevin's question, I mean, I think we have to understand that the type of democratic corporatism that exists in the Nordic countries really goes back to the 1930s, and to a recognition, really, I think, that for small open economies, they're faced with such an external threat that the limit to which they could indulge domestic conflict was sharply circumscribed, let's say. And I think they had a much more mature approach to this probably than we have, and realised that the only way you can survive if you are a small open economy is by a level of agreement at national levels. Why they say, for instance, of Denmark that it has a negotiated economy. I mean, there might be other cultural things as well. I mean, I believe myself that that film I showed there, had a cultural influence on the country and the way its thinking evolved out of recognition we're never going to allow anything like that to happen again. And I finally, perhaps maybe slightly more controversially, I don't know what colleagues would think of this, but it might very well be that it may have a religious dimension. At least some scholars think so, that Lutheranism as a form of Protestantism respects very much the role of princes and the state, and that almost a recognition of the role of the state is very much built into the psyche of Nordic people, whereas so many of our compatriots want to avoid supporting the state at every possible chance. Like, why have we got so many tax exiles? I'm sure that would be an absolute anathema to people from the Nordic countries. Final point, just to mention in relation to Padder's point about innovation, which I think is important. In 1992, the National Economic and Social Council here engaged a Norwegian academic called Lars Mjøseth to have a look at Ireland's situation and compare it with other small open countries in Europe. And one of his key conclusions was that we lacked a national system of innovation, partially perhaps because of immigration and other kind of cultural factors here, but this was a real difficulty for. And of course what we tried to do, you see, we tried to buy one in via foreign direct investment, and I think not very successfully, because of course we didn't get the type of backward and forward linkages that we thought would actually prompt autocentric development in the country. And I think that's partially our problem now, at this dilemma for us at this point in time. Thank you.
It's interesting that one of the only sort of the most self-conscious thing that Ireland has ever imported from any of the Nordic countries in a political sense is the idea of the ombudsman, and this going back to the idea of trust and openness and transparency is something which we imported the institution, but we didn't necessarily import the ethos which is behind it. And I think that that's maybe something that we can come back to later on. Anyway, I think that our first three speakers have really sort of laid a very substantial foundation for the conversation which is going to go on for the rest of the day.